继续 Braid 时空幻境的周年重制版 ，Design 的 Muratory 感觉还需要2期，来先把这个 Muratory 干掉。本来的话嘛，Playthrough 打完一遍，刚好能复习一下关卡，在 Speed Run 之前其实是一个不错的回味，重新再练习一下。现在我感觉把 Design 打完就可以打一次 Speed Run，完整打一次，别的已经搞定了是吧？完整可以来打一次，在 Design 打完之后。这第11期是吧？争取在15期，Design 15期内搞定。KC Muratory， 这个应该是个大坑。Playthrough 我估计很多之前都应该已经看过了。先往上走，我记得从这儿应该也能跳到，对，能跳到这儿。那先把这看了。How the idea for the parallel universe gameplay was developed. Different ways that parallel universes could be implemented. The pit. The pit?
What about the things
of hey, there's a world where you rewind, so now can do some
这看过了。
and one all can change the state.
end up choosing that only exists once,
Etc.
lands on one, yeah.
Yes. And then from there, it's like, okay, well, what do you do if you don't just play back the rewind data? Well, you do input recording. That's the thing that we all knew about because it's a way that you would test your 3D game or whatever back in the day. And like I know some people were very gung-ho about input recording. I always had problems with it of one kind or another. Like there's one point in your game loop where you read input, so just when you do that, also record it and then play it back from exactly that point. In my experience, it always gets more complicated than that. And I don't know if I've just been unlucky or whatever, but I've talked to people who said, no, I just do this and it's a piece of cake. But it's never been a piece of cake for me, including in Braid.
Fair enough.
But I knew that you can do that, and I knew what it was like, and I knew what the results are. And so I said, that's the right thing for this because it means you can change the consequences.
And so by that, you kind of mean, just if I make sure I understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
So there are two ways you could implement this feature. One way to implement this feature is that when I see the playback, like in Braid, there's, you know, I do a thing, I rewind, and then I see like ghost version of me do that thing. In one version, that guy lands on the platforms that are there in his world always. So I can't like move a platform in my world and ever have that affect him because he's literally just going to follow the exact path he followed. No matter what, right?
So to be clear, you know, the rewind data that we spoke of before is numbers like at what coordinates is the guy standing, right? What is the, you know, you could have some integer state variables on or whatever. And the naive version of this or the simple version of it would just be playing those numbers back. And so you could never change anything. If you went that way, you could imagine something where that universe can affect yours.
But not vice versa.
It can't be affected, and that didn't seem that cool. Right.
Different ways。这里上面有连在一起的吗？需要从这儿过来看顶上。操！这个就是那什么scuttled plan to embed classic games inside this game.
I guess the easiest thing to start with today would be something that we mentioned earlier but haven't actually discussed in detail. Which is the idea for like the retro games. So early on,
classic.
I don't know that I ever had a build in which I could play it, but I definitely saw you play the Mountain King retro game. I don't remember myself ever seeing any other retro games, and of course in the final version of Braid there are no retro games.
None of that's in there.
Maybe it would be a good time to just like go over, like, what was the plan there? Why did you decide you didn't want the plan? And what would it have looked like had it actually been implemented?
Well, so the general layout of the game is highly patterned, right? There are some number of worlds. You collect puzzle pieces in them. It's the same number of puzzle pieces. They have entrances from the house. In the middle of the worlds, there's a puzzle frame where you can stop by and do the pieces, at the end there's always this stuffed animal dinosaur dude, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it had been the idea, and this probably started as one of those mildly wacky ideas, but then inside each world, somewhere in the middle, kind of like the puzzle frames are now, there would be some door that you could go through that would take you to some other video game
Okay.
that was essentially a port of the game, like not a super 100% fidelity port. Like it's not trying to look exactly like the original one
Right,
pixel for
right.
pixel, but the point being, it's an adaptation of that game modified by the rules of time in the world that you were in.
Okay.
And why? Well, because I was making this game and I wanted it to be big and cool and have cool ideas in it, and that seemed like one. Braid itself being rooted in a Super Mario Brothers kind of a thing suggests that to begin with, right? Possibly some of this thought began way back when I was thinking about, should it be a Super Mario Brothers thing or something else? And I'm thinking about what are the different game genres and all this, right? And so I had some ideas. I never got even so far as to know what all the games would have been.
Okay.
Because it's a little bit hard to come
Right.
up with a retro game and then not only okay, it's not that hard to re-implement a retro game. Those games are
Right.
pretty simple by modern standards, even
Right.
in 2008. Especially once you already have a game engine running that like does 2D stuff and whatever. It's like,
Right.
okay, we just transpose the arcade game into this system that I
Yeah.
have running. The hard part is, can I pick and curate arcade games where the combination of that old game and the way it worked and the new rules of time make something interesting and gratifying to play? And I wasn't really able to solve that problem, although I didn't spend an intense amount of time working on it, because at some point it became clear, oh, the game's just going to be too big if I do this for everything. But I did prototype it a bit for Mountain King, which, okay, so Mountain King is a game from the 80s that was ported to a number of systems. I probably mainly played it on the C64, but I believe it even existed on the VIC-20 and even on the Atari 2600 maybe. There was like a kind of a bad port of it.
Was this a home computer game primarily, or was it an arcade game that then
I
got
never
ported?
saw it in an arcade.
Because I haven't either
I believe
ever,
it was
so-
a home computer kind of
So
game.
it may have been just whole cloth, never in an arcade
Yeah.
kind of thing.
Anyway, the way that it works is you start on a mountain where quote unquote mountain is a bunch of sort of parallel platforms that as you're lower down, it's almost a little bit random feeling, like you have a long strip of platform and then a hole and whatever. But as you go toward the top, it sort of narrows out and becomes like mountain peaks. So if you want to go up the
I
mountain,
see.
you're jumping from level to level to get to the top.
So if you're on the furthest left of this mountain, jumping up would not go anywhere
Well,
because there isn't maybe
The
anything
map
there?
wraps around, but you can go down to the very bottom level where, there's some kind of Indiana Jones situation where there's like a giant spider that patrols back and forth.
Okay.
But so you can open this door and climb up to a throne room where there's a crown.
Okay. This is very complicated.
Now, once you put on the crown,
Yes.
music starts, the Hall of the Mountain King theme,
Oh.
and you have until the song ends to get to the top of the mountain while wearing the crown.
Just like The Witness.
A little bit.
Right. Right.
But for some reason, it's one of those games that I really remember a lot. I'm not sure exactly. Like, it was just very different from other games of the time in how it worked, And I didn't try to exactly reproduce the map or anything, but it
Right.
was the same kind of a thing.
Right.
And, I had fun implementing that. It was, again, like a week or less. Like, that's always a fun thing when in a few days you can
Right.
sit down and bang something out and it's like there.
Yeah.
But like people didn't really like it. Like literally nobody I talked to liked it, which it's normally not a huge influence on how I make decisions, right? For that to be negative and to be worth putting in the game as a negative playtest result, it has to be a really good idea that makes the game stronger.
Right.
And so far it's just a random idea that I thought would be fun. And
Right.
so let me think about it more. do I see how it's a really good idea that's integral to the game that makes the game better? And I never came up with a way that was true. It was just an additional thing that was cool the whole time.
Right.
And then it was like, well, what happens when you win? Because all of them were going to be things with win conditions. Is it like yet another collectible?
Right.
And I may have already had both of the current kinds of collectibles in there. And
Right.
like a regular collectible plus a secret one is kind of cool. But like a third one, now it's a casual game or something where you have different currencies and whatever, right?
Right. Yeah.
And so I didn't exactly want to do that, but I didn't know what would be better.
拼图
So
星
yeah,
星再
I
加个
just,
别的。
I just was like, dump it.
So underlying this discussion, though, is kind of something which I don't think I totally understand to begin with,
Yeah.
which is that Mountain King was implemented for World 1, if I remember correctly.
I do not remember which world it was. I was about to say it was World 2 because
Oh,
I feel
okay.
like it had rewind.
Okay, so because what I was going to
Or
say
it
is,
might have even been World 3.
how was Mountain King modified by the time mechanic then?
I think it wasn't really, and that was part of why
Abandoned.
things were not totally borne out. Like, my guess is it was World 3, and the crown was sparkling.
Oh, okay.
So if you lost it, you couldn't rewind. And so
Right.
it did enhance it a little bit in that you knew what these things meant from the main game,
I see.
and it gives it just a little bit of a mental like tinge, and you can rewind up until like getting the crown, and even after getting it you could rewind, but like you wouldn't have it. But like it wasn't that big of a change either.
So
it was just like, oh, I've got my own version of Mountain King, and that's fun.
Yeah. So it sort of sounds almost like the problem was that old arcade games, unless maybe you just missed some or something, don't suddenly become interesting in a time sense just by turning these things on. It seems more like maybe games sort of have to just be designed with this in mind to be interesting, so it's not...
I don't
know?
know, because
Okay.
I was looking for the magic.
Yeah.
I didn't totally find the magic, but I also didn't look that hard.
So
and
maybe it
so
was just a perseverance issue, and it was like, the game doesn't need this, so let's just move on.
I'm not going to claim that the thesis is one way or another. I
Okay.
would say that if you wanted to do this, if you picked a random arcade game and a random time modification, yes, probably
Right.
the combo is not very good.
Right.
So the question is like, is there a large enough subset of things that you could realistically find one that's good? But that's
Right.
not that different from what I do when I design games anyway.
Right. Did you have any other arcade games in mind had you chosen to pursue this idea?
Yeah, I didn't implement any other ones,
Right.
but I was thinking about Burger Time for some reason because
Mm.
so it didn't totally make sense, but like Burger Time with World 4 would mean that the burger was like coming back up if you went left.
That does sound awesome.
So I was sort of thinking about that, but it's still not really playable unless you do some other stuff, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Maybe you could have it be sort of toroidal, so if you walk off the right side, you come back on the left.
you know, I didn't even think of that, but
Feels like that would sort of make it work.
and it's weird because Mountain King was rapping, I think.
Mm. I think that's probably everything there is to say about the retro games, because they didn't really...
Yeah, it was never a major part of the game.
Yeah, it seemed like it was dropped pretty early from my recollection.
Yeah,
you
well,
know.
it took a while to try it out, so like the idea hung around for a while,
Yeah.
but then it was gone. And you know, it was dropped before we did good art for the game or whatever, right? Which was the second half of development.
那还挺早的，讨论了10分钟，死过瘾了。Keys, gates, and keeping puzzles simple. Reversible，下一个 Reversible。好，就这儿。Where does the magic come from when you are solving puzzles？这没看过吗？
There are other ways. There are other
看过。
things that I magic. Well, few enough things. There is no
对，
nobody
看过。
why this was doing over the course of designing Braid was getting a feel for
For
what is more magic and what is less magic.
最后这句话突然又没什么印象。
There are from something that I learned come from
但这个游戏我看过。
You can look at the level.
啊，I know
There
this
was
is
some-
impossible，
so
对对对，
it-
看过了，想起来了，哎。
there are two parts to the level. There's an above ground part and a below ground part, and they're pretty much separate.
Okay.
So you go to the below ground part, and there's a key that's pretty easy to get.
Right.
And then there are two gates, and you have one key and two gates, and you might think, oh, I need to go look for the other key, but there's no other key on the level. And so you hopefully learn that you can open two gates with one key by, judicious use of your abilities. It's not that hard of a puzzle. In fact, you could solve that one accidentally because it's so simple.
Right. And the way that works out is because there are marked, like some of the elements are marked rewind exempt, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And then there's a harder puzzle right below that is a similar situation but with three gates.
Okay.
And so there's a bit of a progression there.
I see.
Okay, you get this. Do you get this, which is a more complex version of the same thing.
Right.
But it's certainly not asking you to do the same thing twice.
Right. It's asking you to do a similar thing.
Similar thing, but not the
Yes.
same.
I mean, the same thing a bunch of times just turns into like Towers of Hanoi or whatever,
Yes.
which is one of the most
Yes.
annoying so-called puzzles in the universe.
Yes.
I mean, it's fine, 2,000 years ago or whenever it was invented for like manipulating blocks because that's kind of fun, but it's not so fine in a modern video game.
韩诺也不是河内吗？他说的难道是有可能是华人道是吧？Manipulating blocks, mapping timing onto space 啊，这肯定看过。Fickle companion 啊，这里那是。
World 4 game some robust
Side.
yeah. It wasn't that sophisticated, but I don't care, right? There's not that many objects in this game. It's a proof of concept. It's all good.
Right.
Yeah.
啊，这个学校了是吧？
With regard to how did I come up
这个
with the different worlds, I just had ideas.
啊，这个应该是那
And
个
of course, I
start
would have an initial guess. Some
Give any.
detail. So the jumps, so that the blocking very right. On the other hand, if I shot, but
对，这个应该是上期看。
maybe if them in their other worlds
那
don't
个
catch
stars
that word
在一起。
and
Yeah.
avoid-
Yeah.
So, yeah, it just wasn't good,
Right. Right.
And I saw that relatively quickly. Although that said, it's possible that I missed something, right? And there would have been something cool there. Another one that I'm have to do. It's the same.
In the prototype, there was a world where gameplay was turn-based 啊，回合制。
Okay, so another thing that I implemented and was in one of the versions of the game, although probably not in the very first one. Again, thinking about the physics basis of the game originally, what are some things about physics at a small scale? Well, things are quantized.
Quantized.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff about that with like the speed of light moving like in increments or
Or
something.
like black body radiation,
Yeah.
for example, being only solvable. Like that's how quantum mechanics was discovered, was like if you try to solve the equations for when things get hot, what wavelengths should they emit and how much, it was like nonsensical and didn't match measurements, right?
Okay.
And then to match measurements, it turns out like, oh, if you can only give off photons at certain discrete energy
Photon 是光
levels,
子是吧？啊，对，
then
应该
this
光子。
all works out. And that's actually how they started looking at quantum mechanics.
Which
right?
is mildly terrifying because you don't normally think of things in the real world as being quantized. But-
yeah, but they,
Yeah,
they
it's
totally
fine.
are, right?
Okay.
So
Quantum
God ran out
mechanics.
of bits, I guess.
I don't think that's what happened. But anyway, so
So there's a mechanic based on this quantization.
what if,
was
since
the
the
mechanic?
game is about time now,
Yeah.
then the quantization would affect time. And so what I implemented was, again, time, the whole game is paused.
Okay.
And then instead of, how you use the arrow keys and you have the jump button, right?
Yes.
嗯
Instead of those being
，continuous
inputs,
input 回啊，这是回合制是吧？
you get this little like control HUD that pops up over your guy that has like the 4 arrows and the jump
Oh.
button.
Oh, I remember this.
And then you hold them down because you might want to go
Yes.
diagonal or something.
Yes.
All
If
right.
you just want to go forward, you tap forward and release
Release
it, and
it.
your guy goes a certain amount, running the continuous simulation for a fixed amount of
I
time.
see.
Right. If you wanted to go diagonal and jump, you hit all 3 of those and then release them.
嗯
and he does that.
I see.
Right?
So you kind of it's like a turn-based Braid.
Turn-based, but with the same simulation underneath, because
Right.
I mean, you could invent in a whole entire turn-based version of the game, and some
Right.
people might do that, but
Right.
it didn't seem along the lines of what I wanted to do.
Okay.
Like, this wasn't a game where you go into totally different simulators in every world. It was a game where
Right.
it's the same one, but it's modified.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I did that, and again, I had trouble coming up with puzzles and controlling situations to make them interesting. And it was just this mode of having a discrete time step that then played out in a simulation. It was pretty sloppy, and it was hard to even think about what was going to happen. Like, what's a typical thing that happens in this game? Well, there's a monster, maybe he's walking away from you toward a wall, and he's going to bounce off, and then you want to jump on him.
Right.
And in continuous mode, in the beginning, that might be hard to learn, like when to jump and how, if you want to bounce
Right.
off him.
Right.
Mm.
In this mode, it was way even more awkward to
Right.
learn,
Right.
and the end result just wasn't good. Like,
Right.
okay, I'm doing this interaction, and that's cool, but
啊，我懂他意思。
I'm not getting more out of the interaction than I put in.
这样其实与其说是 turn based，不如说把那个什么 continuous time 变成 discrete。continuous 就你就一直这么操作。如果 discrete 的话，你一旦跳起来，中间你可能空中根本就没有什么 air time 了，对吧？我现在跳起来不是能一直操作了吗？它这话就一旦你一个输入过去了啊，那也可以是回合制吧。就回合制，在你前个回合做出指令之后，在下一个回合到来前你是不能动的，差不多啊这个意思。The idea for the time slow down ring 啊，这就是那个 pit 里面一个 ring 啊，这肯定看过。
Just see how that
它这个
nuances
讨论也
from
好，游戏也好，
and then
有
go.
大量的这个理工的
Yet
概念，
also, I got two things down much, holding the
从
ring
数
up
学
and
到什么量子物理，
Well, based on
到什么计算机，
playable.
你觉得
Monsters
相当多的玩家真的能
that
听得懂
we
吗？
explored, that's the reasoning, or some of the reasoning, right? I never actually went and explored that, and
你
sometimes
可
I
能
do
能
it
听懂
and
一
you
些，
find
但
that
你要
there's
想
something
全部
you
听懂，
didn't
我觉得
think
挺难的
of, or-
这个
Right,
算涉猎
right.
的。
But this one worked, so it
It was
wasn't
fun. I
necessary.
started doing it, and I found it was cool, and there was enough to do with it, right?
但当你网上搜一圈这些玩家的评论之后，我发现很可能大多数玩家还真听得懂，这很可能就是物以类聚，人以群分。没准真正对此游戏感到有兴趣，你会认可它的，很可能相当一票还真的就是理工科的学生啊。性别不讨论，专业上面基本8、9不离十还是挂钩的。如果你专业完全不挂钩，或者说对这方面的东西有抵触的话，我觉得你也不太会喜欢这种游戏，这种逻辑性很强的游戏 ，puzzle-based game。Designing the key passing puzzle 啊，哈哈。When there's more than one key, which one gets picked up？ 哦，这不错。Why this level has no name 啊，就那关系吧。3个，就非常的这种非常强的逻辑性。这个游戏设计的，我觉得比那个Baba Is You来好。那个呢，到后面我觉得已经像在解这个奥林匹克的题目了。最后那些关很可能现在来看的话，没准是 community design， 就不是说官方的题目，没准是一些同人就是 mod 嘛。你要拿别的游戏来说，玩家社群自己自制的 mod， 然后被官方所认可，然后 DLC 追加了之类的这样的感觉。但那些题目难度真的是不正常的，就真的不正常。我觉得如果你完全不用攻略，能一点点解下来，解出一道可能还行。因为后面的题目不是说一共就是像这个 Braid 一共不是8颗星星吗？你要算上有思路跟操作各有吧，是吧？但真正你说都很鬼畜的8颗星星里面有4颗应该不到，对吧？但Baba Is You的话，操蛋的关后面10关、20关、30关都是，就每一关如果你不靠攻略，很可能要研究好一段时间，好几个小时，然后你发现你还不一定做得出来，就都压力死给讲呢。
In a Time magazine article, they quoted you of saying the following: "I've been interested for a long time in what kinds of communication are possible.
Jonathan
Are
Bloch,
there other forms of
Science,
communication that we can
Language and
refine
Reality。
in the way that we've refined language?"
大概是
In a Time
无法
magazine article, they quoted you of saying the following:
quoted you。
"I've been interested for a long time in what kinds of communication are possible. Are there other forms of communication that we can refine in the way that we've refined language?" And it's almost an experiment going on that you're doing where you're like, how much can I communicate without directly talking at you. Like what sorts of things can I create in a game before English gets deployed, right?
Yes.
Like, did you want to say anything sort of big picture about that to go with all the things you said, which are kind of all about that in a way?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely an idea that I got a glimmer of during Braid.
Mm-hmm.
The Witness is like a lot about this.
说 Steam 上也有
But going back
但
to
这个
Braid,
就是
it's like
3D
I
了
was learning it and playing with it a little bit. And one of the standout examples for me,
暂
and
时
it's,
不准备考
it's
虑。
probably going to be hard to explain. Like it's going to seem like a small thing, right?
Well,
But there's a level in World 5, which is the alternate universe one, where you need to get a key
啊，
across
这关是
a
吧？
pit,
嗯，
mm-hmm.
right? And the original version of this level was different from how it is now. The original version of the level
alternative design。
was maybe, like we were saying before, a little too obvious.
Okay.
The way in which it was a little too obvious was, the idea was I wanted a key shared between universes because one of the things that could happen is one instance of you could transfer it to another instance of you, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, in the original version of this level, you would go over. So if you're going to pass the key from one instance to another of the guy, there sort of has to be a reason why that guy just can't do the thing that you were going to do,
嗯
right?
Okay.
Let's just say it's a key that opens a gate that's on the left. Even if that gate isn't shared in the universes, if he walks over there and opens it and then you rewind and that key's not rewind exempt, now he's going to walk over there and open it, and he's not shared between universes, but the key is, so it'll open the gate in your universe, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in order to make this idea work, there has to be some constraint that the Shadow Universe guy just cannot go to the target position
Okay.
for whatever reason.
Okay.
So my original idea was, well, you just sort of fall down a thing that's too high to go back up, and there's like a hole, like the Count of Monte Cristo or something, that you put the key through. Right?
So-
Count of Monte. I don't think I know. I mean, I know
It's a
vaguely
famous,
the reference.
but
It's
I'm
a
thinking
famous
of
book,
this.
but
Again, it's a little bit of a Calvino reference because
Okay.
he has his own Count of Monte Cristo take.
okay. All right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
All right.
that works
Mm-hmm.
because the guy can't go through the hole in the wall. But holes in the wall do not happen that often, right? Like sometimes I had already been putting them as, there are holes that the monster can fit in. They're little monster tunnels where we would put a key or something, right? And I
Okay.
might put a little lip on it just to help emphasize the fact that the player can't go in there, even
Right.
though without the
Monsters
lip
only.
doesn't do anything. Yes.
No Tims allowed.
Yes.
再看一下。
So I designed this on it just to help emphasize the fact that the player can't go in there, even
Right.
though without the
Monsters
lip
only.
doesn't do anything. Yes.
No Tims allowed.
Yes. So I designed this and it worked mechanically, but it did exactly what I was saying before, which is it's too frickin' obvious.
嗯
Now, one way to make it less frickin' obvious is there's a whole bunch of these weird holes in the walls. Like he's in the mail room of a large corporation now. and
Right,
there's just
right, yes.
mail slots in all the doors. I don't
Yes,
know, right?
yes. You could have made it a more standard environmental feature everywhere, but then it begs the question why.
That makes the whole game noisy, right? That's
Exactly.
not very good.
Yeah.
Just for one puzzle, no.
Yeah.
right? But the other thing you can do is think, how can I achieve this via other elements? And what I came up with was, okay, instead of just a wall there's a pit. And we can even add a little bit of a verticality to the two sides of the pit to make it even more clear that you just can't really jump out from the right going to the left. You're just going to die.
Right.
Right? It used to be this guy's just sort of standing somewhere and pushing the key through the mail slot, right?
Right.
Now he has to jump into spikes and kill himself
Right.
to
概念图
hand me the key, right?
Then die.
Yeah.
And that's me, and I just did intentionally do it,
He's sort of a martyr.
and he's gonna go
What?
away anyway. But
Yeah.
it's weird, and it's in this strange space that I was aiming for, but it's very dramatic in a way that a lot of things in the game aren't.
Yeah.
So that was also good. That was a reason why I like that version of the level.
Interesting.
長っクソ長いなこれ啊，这就 keep us in puzzle。这个是吗？
Most way. Like if you called it
这个啊 hand off 对，这关这个就是那个 pattern break。
and I'm nothing to realize if they forget the initial conditions.
Right, yeah.
And so initial conditions are important.
Right. Yeah. 啊，对，就这样，才要看吗？这讨论到 gap way 去了。它这个东西实在是太复杂了。Why are you doing this? It's just not good, mate. More than one key. 顺序
Already there's an interesting
这我没看过。
Mm-hmm.
like a game mechanics question or a programming question. Like if both of you are overlapping the key, who actually
takes
gets
it?
it?
Yeah.
啊，
I
优先度的问题。
prioritized like okay, the newest instance, which is always the one that you're live playing, gets it, right? But that doesn't
Fuck.
have to be the rule.
Fuck.
That's one of those rules that you make up. That's a second order thing that fills in and helps make sense of, or helps instantiate the more general rule about keys could be shared between universes or whatever.
Right.
Right.
Because somebody has to. When we don't know from some grand scheme what the rule should be, someone has to make. The designer has to make up
对
what
对
the
对，
rule is that fills in the gap.
Yeah, and there's a lot of art to making that decision correctly because you can come up with a very uninteresting game by making that decision wrong.
Right.
Right. So why World 1 is small? 这是什么傻屌问题？
What were we talking about? In World 1,
It's smaller.
it is
It's
smaller, and that's kind of okay. Well, it's definitely okay, but why?
But why?
Because it comes at the end.
Okay.
The shortness of the puzzles leading up to the ending is used to make a sequence that, again, while you're in the middle of the sequence, you kind of know something different is going on.
Right.
Well, especially because you went into the door in the attic and all that. Like, you
Right.
know something different is going on, and you're
Right.
just trying to picture the boundaries of like what's happening here, or you've gone through levels like the other level we mentioned. They don't have titles, and they don't have puzzle pieces. You're just getting to a door, which interestingly is what the original World 1 was too. There weren't puzzle pieces in the game at that time. So that's a case in which being of a different size is fine. Also, the epilogue is also, a few screens.
Right. Yeah.
If the epilogue had 12 different things to do, it would be a very different experience, and I'm not sure. Like, design would have to change in some way.
Right.
Epilogue 其实还真有些隐藏的东西，这东西我现在还没发现过，等到时候玩那个 playthrough 再来看。这个应该这儿吧？对，Figuring out the mechanics of World 1。
In Braid, there are definitely some little tool-like things, but they're mostly the minimum that I had to do to ship the game.
Okay.
So, for example, in World 1, aka World 7,
World 7。
there's this idea that physics is running backwards for the monsters that live there.
Right.
From your perspective.
嗯
How do you make physics run backwards? Well, again, you could just play back a bunch of recorded frames, but then things can't really change unless you were to like break things out of that recording and simulate them when you interacted with them. But
Right.
then to whatever extent that the backward simulator differed from how the look and feel was of the recording, the game would feel awkward.
Right.
So that is just not really seeming like a good way to go at all.
Right.
So instead I said, well, let me come up with some relatively constrained interactions that I can run backwards. And so I have this little mode that still exists in the game if you're in developer mode. And it's like you run a level forward, and when a monster gets shot out of a cannon, it makes a marker with a certain string tag, monster shot out of cannon, right?
Okay.
And then when it bounces off the ground, it's like monster bounce. At this is the incident velocity into the ground, right? And whatever. And then you can play those backwards,
I see.
right? So those markers get saved out with the level, and then the monster if it's walking backwards and hits a marker that says a monster landed here at this velocity, you launch it up at the opposite vector, right?
Yes, yes.
And that actually never completely worked correctly, but it was close enough that like I could fiddle with it and it was fine.
Gotcha.
But that was necessary kind of to ship the game, because otherwise, like, how do I launch monsters backward into cannons and have them get eaten in a way that looks enough like
the
you're
real
just doing it
thing.
by hand?
Yeah.
You could do that, but like it's not going to look like the reverse of what happens. And
Right.
that's important because when you rewind, it'll be going forward and
Right.
it should look exactly like the
Like it
regular
was,
game.
yeah.
So, you know, sometimes you need tools to get things done.
ça，这样这部分就结束了。这边这一部分也结束了。这个 screen 算结，这个 screen 是几个世界风格叠在一起的，是吧？这个几来着？这个是2还是3？左上角是4了，对吧？然后这个是5，顶上那个是6嘛。每个世界有每个世界的风格。这个要么是2，要么是3嘛。然后这顶上也看过了，那就这里也可以从左往右想，什么东西？The starting screen， 操，这都行。我操，这连在一起的是吧？3连是吧？哦，放在这儿了。哎，怎么放在这儿了？哦，Holy shit！Holy
I
shit！
had an idea
1分60秒。
an experience that I wanted the player to have at the start of the game.
Okay.
Just an art thing. Like, wouldn't it be nice if
Mm-hmm.
the following?
Okay.
Following.
You see yourself silhouetted and you have this like simple moment. And that includes all sorts of even pragmatic things, like the game not booting to a menu and just booting to this scene that almost
Right.
could act like a screensaver until you start playing the game. all
And there's
this,
not
right?
like 50 logos that come up. And et
Zero
cetera, et cetera,
logos,
right?
yeah.
0
You know,
logo
the first thing a lot of people want to do is put their company logo
啊，这个
that
挑
nobody's
logo
ever
了。
heard of or cares about, and that's the first thing you see. And I'm
Yep.
like, no. And in fact, Witness was the same way. It boots, and then you're in the hallway.
Yep.
Yeah. The other thing, and it's related, but a little bit meta, is because my agenda was for this to be an art game,
Mhm.
and not just to be an art game, but to show other designers and players
What I think。
like this is a way that games can be
Mm-hmm.
that games usually aren't
Mhm.
being,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it was to make a point, kind of like the game starts up, you see a thing, it's not like Mario.
Right.
You're like, what exactly is going on?
Yeah.
And it's a statement.
在玩之前，你
This
可能觉得很
experience
像
you're
马里奥
about to have is different from the ones that
啊，
you're
对，
used
就
to.
这个
Like,
意
I
思，
wanted to hit people with that right away,
Okay.
就很
but
意
in
外
a。way that was also beautiful and nice.
Okay.
So that was a very early idea.
Okay.
Like those initial builds of the game that I sent to you guys didn't have this. It was just like you're in level 1 or whatever.
But you had wanted it at
这
that
个确实做
Well,
了。
I don't know, but
Okay.
but relatively soon after, once I
Okay.
started thinking about how do I put all this together, like that came in there.
当你真正开始玩了1-2个小时之后，你发现跟你刚下单购买那会儿，你所期望的确实不太一样。
I guess
这是抢 logo 是吧？
exactly what that means because there's the whole thing with
没看，我看一下吧。
I guess I don't really know, but I know you've said that you got the idea for Braid in late 2004.
2004
It was your idea, actually.
Your idea.
And I've always been a little confused by that, but I mean, I guess I sort of know what you mean. But so, why don't you walk us through exactly what that means? Because obviously there's the email that I wrote that I think you're referring to,
Yeah.
but I think there's a deeper through line there because that part is just one piece of it. There's the whole thing with like invisible cities and
Oh, yeah,
like
yeah, yeah.
there's all these other lineages that are like involved there, and I don't really know in what order these start gelling together. It's obviously not just like, oh, there's this one email and everything happened after the email. There was like a bunch of things, I feel like. So
Yes.
就没了 ，yes 了。刚打开你觉得感觉就不太一样。Designing the house to aid in the non-linear structure of the game. Non-linear structure.
So the house, well, I'd had this idea that if it's a puzzle game, I think the idea that you would be able to trivially run through the levels came much later. But
Okay.
before that, it was like, okay, these
Oh.
levels are going to have puzzles. I had done enough looking at games to see that if you have a very linear structure and you have puzzles, people get stuck on a puzzle and then they can progress no further in the game.
Right.
And that's terrible.
It's terrible.
They get mad at the game. There's plenty of enjoyable times that they would be able to have that you're not letting them have.
Yep.
And you're not even giving them that much of a chance to figure out the puzzle, because banging your head against one thing is not that great, even for just processes of thought, right?
Right.
If what helps you solve the puzzle is better facility with the universe of this game and how the rules work and all that, then like if I just give you more experience with the game in different contexts,
Right.
then you're better armed to come back and solve whatever you were stuck on. So all of this led me to think, okay, we want a structure where if there are a bunch of worlds with different physics in them, like we probably should introduce them roughly in some sequence, but who's to say you have to solve them in sequence or even play them in sequence, right? And so it's deliberately different from a book that way. Although again, books like Dictionary of the Khazars are deliberately nonlinear, but it's very rare in a book to do that.
Right. Most books are linear.
Yeah, like Choose Your Own Adventure is deliberately nonlinear.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
But this was a way of trying to make the puzzle game good. Okay, so if it's kind of nonlinear and you can go to things in whatever order, how do you know when you're done? How do you get to the end? I can't just put the end after World 6 or whatever, because what if you haven't finished the other ones? So there's got to be something gating you from the ending.
Right.
And it would be nice if that was something where you could see your progress incrementally. Like you could imagine there's from the ending.
Right.
And it would be nice if that was something where you could see your
incrementally.
progress incrementally. Like you could imagine there's just some door that's locked until everything else is done and then it opens. And that is functionally what is there. But I came up with this thing where like, you know, the different ladders are there based on what worlds you finished, and you can climb higher, although you can't really get to anything. So that feels a little bit better. And if you've solved them discontinuously, there'll be a gap where you can't climb, but then you see the other ladder out there and you get this feeling of progress. You get the visual feedback of progress, and there's this mystery of like what's in that attic. Right. And you get the whole game to think about that, because you see the attic at the beginning.
Right.
And I mean, if you poke around, and at some point, probably long before the end, because you end up coming back to this house between every world.
Right.
And every time you quit the game and restart it, you're back in the house. And so you probably poked around at some point and you're like, oh, what's up there? And I never put a sign saying you're trying to get into the attic, right?
Yeah.
But it's natural to want to know.
Yes.
That's
And
curiosity.
so that all seemed like a good way to structure it.
是吧？
You know, you kind of want to flesh it out and figure out the structure of the game. And if these are puzzles made out of puzzle pieces like they were at the time, you need to have enough to make a puzzle in each world.
Right.
And even if that weren't the constraint, it's still awkward maybe at a game of that size to have some areas with a lot of puzzles and some with a few. Although again, with The Witness I made the opposite decision, but that works better because of the structure of that game being bigger. And like there was a decision.
What do you mean
early-
by the opposite decision?
Well, in Braid, it's very regular, right? There are 12 puzzle pieces in
I
each
see.
world.
Oh, okay.
right? And so if a world doesn't have 12 puzzle pieces, maybe I'm not done designing it.
I see.
And in The Witness, it was more like going into it, I see that the design space is going to be more irregular than that. So I'm
I see.
simply going to avoid any structure of that kind.
Because basically, you'd have to cut too many puzzles or add too many puzzles
To make it
some of the
12.
sections. If you tried to pick like the median number or something and
Yeah.
have everything hit that, it just wasn't going to work.
Right. Even in Braid, there's probably a little bit of that. Like there are probably, if I thought harder on some worlds, there are really good puzzles that could be
Could
there.
be there.
But I was done thinking about it because there were 12.
12. Gotcha.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then the worst thing than that actually is I don't have 12, and so I need to start to make filler, right?
Right.
And that's sort of why the number is 12. It's because that was the degree to which I found that I didn't really need filler
Okay.
to have
Filler is
enough.
terrible.
So maybe some world in Braid would really have liked to have been 13 or 14, but it was just better to go, okay, the world where I have the least ideas for puzzles, they hit about 12, so we're just going to call it 12 and because I want it to be regular.
Yeah, and I probably made the decision for 12 provisionally before I had that verification,
I see.
but it was a guess that turned out to be okay.
Gotcha.
如果你要搞15，现在你只有12个，你还去额外设置3个谜题，这种感觉确实很难受。这种感觉最好还是要避免，因为到后面，哎，什么阶段做什么事儿，哎，最后一个阶段来搞这种事情就很麻烦了。The ladders that go up to the attic.
Just so we're clear on what a reward is, though, because somebody who is not necessarily familiar with exactly what's going on in all of these types of designs is the fact that in Braid I put together this puzzle and then the ladder to the attic goes over, right? Like, why isn't that a reward? Or so can you be a little bit more specific just for anyone who was unclear on what those two things were? What to you differentiates this sort of thing into two categories where one is a reward and the other is actually just part of the game design?
Well, we can we can turn a dial here.
Okay.
And so the thing that you're talking about with the ladders, it is technically a reward.
Okay.
It's a muted one, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's an acknowledgement of progress where you expect the feeling of satisfaction comes internally from the player, right? Like, oh, I see that I made this progress that probably I had planned out. Like the first one, you don't really know what's going on, but after one or two, you're like, okay, I want the third one now.
Right.
And then you see that you got the third one now, and you're like, okay,
this is good.
And you decide that it's good.
You decide.
Yeah.
Now, you can turn a dial about how extrinsic it is.
Extrinsic.
So the one that's there right now is almost completely intrinsic in that we're not taking very many steps to get you hyped. Right?
I want to say the camera doesn't even really pan to it or anything.
No, it
right?
doesn't. You just
kind
climb
of
up there and you see it.
Yeah.
I'm not a big fan of camera pans.
Yeah.
I almost never do them.
Yeah.
It takes extra programming. Whereas, interestingly, so that game company, which is a different game company, they're very concerned with having people feel specific emotions, and they do camera pans all the time.
Okay.
So that's an interesting difference that you can think about.
Camera pan.
So, what else could I do? Well, I could. So when you get a ladder in place, is when you put the last puzzle piece in and put the puzzle in the frame, right?
Right.
I could do a camera pan at that time.
哦，我懂这意思。他这么说就懂了。
It's still utilitarian because I want to just make sure that you notice
this thing.
But it's also making a bigger deal.
他这么形容我就懂了。
Well, instead of a camera pan, you could do a camera pan with like a cool sound effect.
Yeah.
And like maybe it materializes in place, right?
Yeah.
And that's cooler. You're making a bigger moment out of it.
You play Flight of the Valkyries.
Well, again, you can keep going. Like instead of it materializing, maybe it materializes with like gold stars that shoot off like fireworks or whatever. Maybe the little dinosaur guy and his friends have a little parade around you and then walk up to the thing, right? And they're like tooting on the horns and stuff.
Or Bloopy.
Right?
Bloopy could come out.
Bloopy could come out and say, congratulations, that is the fourth ladder, which is even better than the third ladder. You're way better at this game than you've ever been before. And there's only 2 ladders left. And I'm sure it's going to be so amazing when you get that last ladder, right? This is more and more extrinsic. And there are multiple dimensions to it. Like there's, shooting off the fireworks and making a big deal out of it. But there's also like rhetoric, like you're so strong because you beat that boss.
Yeah.
You're such a smart person for figuring out that puzzle. And games do all of these things.
Yes.
And, well... If you look at the games on the phone, they're one certain way.
Yeah.
Right? And they're that way for a reason.
They're that way for a reason.
And this is a little bit of an interesting thing then, because it's really not possible to dial the extrinsic part all the way to 0. Like there's always trace amounts of it, even
Right, because you didn't have to prevent the person from going to the attic. They could have just gone to the attic at the beginning of the game. So the fact that you chose to prevent them from going to the attic makes getting to the attic a reward by definition.
Well, but also I made it bigger than it had to be. So for example, I put these ladder segments. We worked to make them look a little bit good, like they're in a sequence that you can understand and that's supposed to create drama toward the ending. It could instead be there's a ladder that goes all the way. I mean, we could just let you in, right? But even before that, you could climb up and you walk in front of the door and it says locked :
Right, 2 out of 6
out of 6 puzzles.
Right.
And that's way less extrinsically motivating even than what we're already doing. It's also just less classy and it makes the game less nice and all these things. And so that's my point, is that these things are correlated, and it's really, really hard to get them even anywhere near 0 and still have a good game.
Camera pan 大概就是一个视角给你切过来，比如说当你最后一个拼图拿到拼上去，那此时你肯定不会在这个界面，对吧？然后突然画面一转，给你转到这个界面，告诉你这个梯子已经搭成了，然后再给你切回来，大概这么个意思。你也可以讲是一种强制的视角切换，过场动画，就告诉你已经达成了，达成了什么条件。An initial level design involving rewind that was changed. 这开始。
At the very first level of World 2,
看过了。
There's a few tutorial issues. There's like arrows reading taken out, right? Well, this would make more sense if I could see the raw data. And they're like, no, we're not going to send you any data. I, as the producer, am just going to give you my opinion about what you should do. And I was like, no.
Okay.
But I did change that one thing because it was like, sometimes you already kind of know something's not that good, and it's just like, all right.
Yeah.
Yeah. 就这个。这个居然是 easy puzzle。Damn fuck。这个算3是吧？A convoluted idea about the puzzle frame in World 2。怎么这么多？92。
So now, when it comes to something like the World 2
这应该看过了。
I'm playing a little bit of a game with myself there.
Okay.
Because that isn't about time.
等一下啊。The biggest mistake in the game. 这两个是。
Where does this idea come from? Because, yes, like if you go listen to that lecture that you gave, it's very clear that you think that, for example, some of the stuff you do in Braid has these sequence breaks. Some things you did in The Witness have these sequence break ideas. And you talk about, if on a Winter's Night, a Traveler potentially having these sequence breaks. Like, you're not sure. Your interpretation of the book is like, if you look at it this way, there's these possible things where it's like, oh, comes
ever that I could say, you're not in that pattern, that potential. Break it
to trash and evac
happens. You're building
set of enough speed.
Skis ma.
This thing that
I think that analogy part.
Yeah.
But I haven't done that game.
Right.
Yeah.
Shit my boots. 所以我没把这个拼图复原。这个就那个1分钟不到了，50几秒的时候。对。那看来没看过的就这个了，是吧
？This thing that we're talking about, the World 2 thing, is also the biggest mistake in the game. But not for the reason that we're talking about. And I alluded to this before when we were talking about playtesting, right?
What is the biggest mistake?
The biggest mistake is the following thing.
What?
Everywhere in this game, the first time you see a puzzle,
that's right. That's pattern break related.
And
not true here.
And you don't need to gain extra powers, which you do in other, like if it's Metroid, I need a thing to get up there.
Very common,
right?
Very common.
And when people start the game, they don't know that it's not Metroid.
Right.
And so part of what the game is doing is helping you understand that it's not Metroid. except here. Here, you can't solve the puzzle the first time.
That's by
you get
design.
there. And
I
part
see.
of that had to do with me being afraid in some sense.
Afraid.
Afraid.
Yes, that I would blow the secret and that it would be too easy because there are 4 puzzle pieces or something that you get in the first couple levels.
Yeah.
And if those had the necessary pieces to solve this,
Mm.
if you got them before you got to the puzzle,
OK，
Yeah.
then you would be able to solve it. But if you have a few pieces
就这
and
两
they
片了。
have this highly visually conspicuous element, there's no camouflage for it.
Right.
You just see it right there. And maybe after doing the witness, I would have had more cojones to like try this.
Cojones.
Yeah.
But I didn't at that time. I was
Okay.
like, it just seems to me like it's not going to be good, and people are just going to do it, and they're going to see what the thing is,
and
they're going to do it, and then they're not going to enjoy it because it's just kind of obvious and meh.
I see.
Whereas
meh.
if you don't know the answer and then you have a bunch of puzzle pieces and there's a bunch of visual information to look at, and then you come back to it and you're like, oh,
Oh.
then it makes more sense. There's other things like the thing that solves it could have been in one piece, but
嗯，
it's in 2 pieces.
Right.
对，这里是要2片，
Why? Because it was just a little too narrow
一
and
片差不
small
多
in one
了，演一
piece
片应
and
该可以
fiddly.
的。
Right.
And it felt better to me to put the 2 pieces together and have a big thing. Although programmatically you can solve it with one. Like there is like
Right.
I make a little platform segment
Right,
for each
right.
one. I've been speaking vaguely as though to avoid spoilers, but like it's not like we've said enough detail to tell you. Like there's an image, there's a table
Yes.
in the image, the painting of the World 2 puzzle, and the table looks very, very, very much like one of the platforms that you can stand on, the kind that you can jump
Yes.
up through, but you don't fall through, which is
Yes.
a platformer trope.
Yes.
And so if you realize that, it's really a precursor to the kind of thing that happened in The Witness a lot, right?
Okay.
Even some of the earlier puzzles in The Witness, like there are some trees there and they're conspicuously standing right in front of you and they have information that you want. Spoilers, by the way.
Right.
but
Right.
You don't necessarily know that that's where the information is going to come from.
Right.
And part of the magic is that it's right there. So really this was a prototype for a whole game, actually.
Okay.
if you're going to really think about it.
That's a good point.
Maybe the reason why I insisted on putting it in the game and didn't want to drop it is because I felt like there was really a lot possible there, and I wanted to like get it going
Dip
a
a
little
toe
bit
in.
mentally. Yeah.
Dip a toe in that particular.
Because
pool.
if I threw it away, maybe I would never come back to it,
Right.
you know.
这个都看过了是
So
吧？
now stuff incomparent to the solution.
Know the thing.
I mean, I
okay, yeah.
will these room more complicated reason apply random a little bit of it, right?
Agree on a good case.
哦，就这个是，怪不得。Hunt 啊，直接回到 Hunt。Shit my boots。啊，Hunt 这个肯定看过了。Tweaking the bitmaps for maximum humanity。maximum humanity。啊，就这个是吧？これはまあ見たことあるね。啊，就这个东西。这是什么 jump height 吗？
You said
Reasons.
that in this game, the jump.
Ah, yeah, yeah,
If you go
Yeah.
jump with that pull, the
Right.
like creating it.
Few breaths out.
Really different. So one of the things is in the game level earlier,
看过。
monster item,
Okay.
and so that is the kind of thing that I was doing and wanted to
I
do,
see.
right?
Okay.
Okay. Bitmaps for maximum humanity. Rewind makes the unfair fair. Unfair fair. Leap of faith. 这里还有一个。我操，这里还有2个人。
So on 2, 3, after you go down the pit, you go straight back up the other side,
Yes.
and there's like guys falling down, and there's compartments on the side,
Mhm.
and I remember there
Yoshi's
being a level
Land.
in like Yoshi's Island or something like that that was exactly that.
Okay.
And this one's more unfair. It's like the guy comes down way faster,
Right.
and you don't get as good of an audio cue and stuff. And
Right.
so it's a little bit like frustrating, right? But it's designed to illustrate this idea. All the
Right.
illustration may be very subtle and not gotten by a lot of people who don't think about game design, right? And so you can attempt it again and attempt it again, which you would do in a normal video game, but with a much longer sort of
Right.
experiment loop, because you probably respawn somewhere earlier in the level and at cost to you,
Ah.
which is why it's unfair, right?
Right.
但现在你有
Because you
rewind
lose lives or whatever,
Right.
and here it's like that doesn't happen, right?
because you have rewind.
That was one of the theses in the beginning, like I said in the Moriarty talk, or about the Moriarty talk. He was like, it should be totally free, and you were like, it should just be a feature of the system.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, so I had the high level mission statement. I am not going to cop out by making sand a resource or whatever.
Right.
I absolutely will not do that.
Right.
What I am rather instead going to do is implement the thing and then change the game however is necessary. Okay, so
Right.
a Mario
Yes.
game by itself is proven to be, it can be a good fun game if you do the right things.
Right.
Mm.
So you can picture it as, I start with a good fun game that's just got lives and whatever.
Right.
Okay, we know what that is. Now I mess it up by putting rewind in.
Right.
It's maybe not fun, it's maybe tedious, it's maybe too easy.
Right.
The knee-jerk reaction that a designer would have is like, okay, limit rewind, or you
Right,
only get it during
right.
special times.
Mm.
I'm not going to do that. I'm instead, the only way out is through. I'm going to see rewind stays constant, and then what else about the game needs to
Okay.
change to make it something different. And I had to just have the faith that I would be able to find that, right? And that was again a very experimental gameplay mindset.
Mm.
So it's sort of like flipping the like arrow of action. It's like saying, look, normally what you would do in game design is you would say, we have to modify the feature to fit the existing game design, and you're doing the opposite. You're saying, let's modify the existing game design to fit the feature.
Yes, and if you think about this in terms of exploring the space of game design, then obviously you don't want to retreat back into what is known, but that's
Right.
what almost everybody does all the time.
And if you're modifying the feature, you're sort of by definition saying that's what you're going to do because you're keeping the other side, which is the
Yes.
gameplay,
Constant.
And I believe, I don't remember a lot of what that conversation on the mailing list was, but I bet some of it was like that. Like, well, you know, you ruin consequence and you make the game too easy and all that stuff.
Yes.
But you could mitigate that in the following ways.
Right, right.
And absolutely nobody said, design a whole new game around rewind.
Right. Just like make consequence not the important part. Or whatever.
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sure. That's clear. Rewind, make unfair fair. OK，这样这个 screen 也算搞定了。然后就回到这儿了嘛 ，story screens。Doing metaphor in a game rather than a book. Initial discussions about rewind. The original story screens worked differently. 3个。啊，这个是吧？下一个是什么？下一个怎么还在这儿？所以背景这样了是吧？Metaphor initial discussion 能不能把这里东西看完？能把这里东西看完的话，15期肯定能搞定，13、14期没准 design 就能结束了。这个是非常大的一步啊！来吧，10分钟是不是？
So it wasn't like the first time you read Calvino, you were just thinking it would be cool to make a game like this sometime.
No.
Metaphor.
It was actually much closer to the actual time of making Braid that you first started thinking like, hey,
Hey.
Yeah.
it would be neat to do something like that. Those books that I read.
Yeah, and specifically what I was thinking was, well, you know, in a story, you can just sort of postulate whatever the laws of physics are. Like, okay, the moon comes really close and it pulls the ground up and stuff, right? Doesn't exactly work that way in a game. Especially, like, the more systemic the game is, the more you kind of can't just cheat that sort of thing. You have to more make a system that exhibits those properties. And
Right.
that to me is more magical.
Right.
Right. I was like, there's something cool, and if it's hard, it seems very hard, but if you can do it, it's a little bit more groundbreaking than just doing a story about the thing, right?
OK。
In the field of games, it's a thing that very few people had done. Now, there were other games that did analogies of this sort, right? So
Okay.
one of the earliest ones was Rod Humble's game, The Marriage,
Mhm.
which I'd shown at EGW, which
Right.
like there's two people in this relationship and they're just colored squares on the screen,
Right,
and
right.
you move them around and some stuff happens, and
Right.
you know, and then Jason Rohrer actually had done these two games, Passage and Gravitation. I think they also engage in this kind of analogy where there's a system of rules, and those rules are expressive about the situation that the game's about, right?
Right.
It's not just the plot and the fiction that the game is about, but the rules of the universe that are being set up are expressive of what the game is about. And so I wanted to do something like that. And I wanted to do it about physics because, you know, quantum mechanics, for example, is pretty weird, as is relativity, right? And I thought it would be fun to take that weirdness and instead of, you know, conflating it with human scale things in a fiction kind of way, like those stories do, let's conflate it with human level things by just making the phenomena happen on a human scale.
Right.
And then just like seeing what happens and seeing how to make a game out of that. And that'll be fun and interesting. Like, you know, if there's quantum superposition or something and something's at multiple places until the waveform gets localized, that's one idea, right? Or one thing that comes up in physics a lot is time being bidirectional, right? So, which is even true back in Newtonian physics, but also in relativity and stuff. And so, what does that mean? How do you make a game where time is bidirectional? It's challenging because it seems like almost you can't make anything happen,
Right.
right?
Right.
Because it would have to be a completely pre-recorded sequence for you to go forward and backward. And so what does that mean? And so those questions were just in the air.
I see.
And
they're kicking around in your head, growing over time, somewhere in the 2003, 2004 kind of.
yeah, it may not have even been that. It may have been just the few months before.
So like
I don't know.
2004-ish
Yeah.
times. Yeah.
But you can see like how these are they're both difficult questions to answer
Yes.
and also not very actionable until you have a good answer.
Right. Yeah, you're not really going to be able to do much until you get
something to hold on
to.
Yeah. But then, so there's this mailing list conversation that happens. There was some discussion that probably started with Prince of Persia: Sands of Time had come out or something.
Yes.
And so you guys were talking about rewind in games. And to my recollection, maybe I contributed to this conversation a little bit, but I was not really one of the people with the strongest opinions in it. But there was a lot of conversation about like, did this game do a good job? And then what does rewind ability mean for games going forward, right? And what I remember you saying was, this is obviously a technological feature like rewind was for VCRs.
Yeah.
So it should just be in most or all games as something that you can just do, right? But it's like other people were like, well, you can't do that because you're removing consequence from games. Right.
Yes.
And consequence is important. And like the conversation kind of went back and forth on that for a bit, but I was like, you know, nobody really implemented anything. Right.
Right.
And so then I was on vacation and I was thinking about this physics thing, being able to rewind maps onto this bidirectional time thing that I was thinking about. It's sort of the same idea from a different perspective. Right. And so I kind of been wanting to make this Calvino Lightman inspired game. So I started to have an idea like, okay, this is actionable. If I actually program rewind, then it's both contributing to that discussion because with an implementation, but also answering this question of like, what can I do about this physics game that's actionable? Now, even at that time, I didn't think the whole game would be rewind. It was just like, here's some manifestation of one of the lines of the game. And I did, because Invisible Cities is many different cities and whatnot, I was thinking it would be a lot of different worlds. And one of them would be the rewind world, but like another one was like the quantum superposition world or something. Right?
Yes.
You know, another way to phrase the thing that you were saying is like, look, this is really fundamental. It should just be there. It shouldn't be like a weird game design gimmick. Like for people who don't know Prince of Persia: Sands of Time, which I'm sure most people these days don't, it had sand that you would use to rewind time, and you had a certain number of charges. And when you ran out of rewind charges, which you could pick up on the map, then you start losing lives when you die, right?
And also, for people whose main like touch point for this is playing Braid, when we say rewind, we don't really mean Braid rewind. It was like a really crappy like 10 seconds of rewind tops or something.
And it was not a technically good, like the sound didn't go backwards.
And the animations were all screwed up.
Yeah.
And it was very limited, so you could not like rewind all the way back to the beginning of a long level or anything like that.
No. It was like they had some ring buffer with character positions in it, and then they made the rest up or something.
Yeah, it was and it was not really the kind of gameplay thing that it is in Braid, where it's expected to always work and always go all the way back and all that stuff.
本来就不同的游戏，然后3D 的游戏 Rewind 更加难做了。
But so also with the story stuff, it's like you read some words about time or something, what's going on with this character or that character, before you experience the gameplay, right? And so you don't really even know what to connect to, but after you finish the world, if you were interested enough to go back and read it some more, you then have both halves of the thing and you could maybe see correspondences, right?
Right.
And then similarly, there's structural parallelism between the worlds and stuff, and just things about them that you could notice. Like, on the one hand, I expect a great many people would just walk past the story things and not care about them very much. And that's why it's designed the way it is, as opposed to the original thing. Because in the original thing, it puts it on the screen, and it's like, the point of this screen is only for you to read this text.
这怎么看见？这个应该是看过。它那显示的是这个东西，刚刚显示看过了吗？啊，这里有这么多，哪几个？这边反正对，这边没多少了，这最后一点点东西。啊，这期不想搞得太长。这个是没看过，这个完全没看过，这东西。A speech that inspired Braid， 什么？啊，这个算是 speech。
I had been in person or entirety in
watch it there.
Like this.
啊，就这个。
Exactly.
Yes.
Action seeds of this thing, and they came together at this time.
Right. The game once had more of a shock ending. 最后是 epilogue. 哦。
A different example.
Yeah.
Certain
Okay.
period of time.
It's only a small part of the
established by the game up to that point. But I'm not in danger of disrupting.
Yeah, tiny
the game
part of the
because
game.
This is a tiny part at the end, right? I don't think that ever at something. I just that because
shock.
That's more less comprehensive. That's what had to read as a conventional story, and I didn't care. I was just like, look, this is what I want to do.
This is what I want to do. 这两个留到下一期吗？哎，不用聊下一期。对，这个东西我觉得应该是看过的。Metaphor， 然后这 initial discussion about rewind, screen work differently， 这个应该是看过的。The original。
But so also with the play, right? Have both the worlds and stuff, and just things care about them very
much.
Not
even read them.
Is only for you to read this.
Press spacebar to continue. 这句话有影响。
Through all the dialogue there, where playable menu not going to do for this anniversary. Closer to the original. Strongly, am I suggesting that maybe you want
as the main thing?
The title of that world is big letters at the top. This time, of course, you don't, and sort of tells you what. But those other things, it's okay. You know, I feel good about that. It's the first puzzle game that I ever designed.
Yeah.
First single player game I ever designed. So.
但不确定啊。
You know.
不确定啊。
But so also with the story.
不是完全确定。
You read some words about time or something.
一般这种情况我都已经看过了。
Character or that character, before you experience the gameplay, right? And so you don't really even know what to connect to. But after you finish the world, if you were interested enough to go back and read it some more, you then have both halves of the thing, and you could maybe see correspondences, right?
好像还真没看过。
And then similarly, there's
structural parallelism 没听过。
between the worlds and stuff, and just things about them that you could notice. Like, on the one hand, I expect a great many people would just walk past the story things and not care about them very much.
Not even read them potentially.
And that's why it's designed the way it is, as opposed to the original thing. Because in the original thing, where it puts it on the screen, and it's like, the point of this screen is only for you to read this text and then press spacebar to continue. You almost have to disrespect the game a little bit to not read the text. You know what I mean? Like, if I'm playing a modern game, and like
mashing
I'm
the
mashing
button
through all the dialogue scenes that I don't care about, I'm kind of disrespecting the game.
Yes.
But I have to in order to get to the part that I want to play, right?
Yes.
So here, it's a little bit of a middle ground there where, you do have to walk across the room and you incidentally walk past these pages, but like the function of the room is also just to be the playable menu that contains
Right, the linking.
doors.
Yeah.
And so it's not only the text, and so you kind of don't have to totally disrespect the game. If I were to redesign Braid now, which I'm not going to do
啊，把它
for
放在中间是
anniversary
吧？真的
edition,
正应该
but
看过了，是看过了，当
I
时可能
might
看的不是很认
even
真。
make it like right now it's still a little bit passive aggressive, or that's not the right word. It's a little bit closer to the original thing in that the story text is always between you
嗯，
and
这
the
句话好像没听
doors.
过。
And I
Right.
might mix that up a little bit,
Right.
right? There's an analog dial of how strongly am I suggesting that maybe you want to read the text, right? And it's in the middle somewhere.
我以
I
为
mean,
他要说放在
there's-
关卡里面。
you could imagine a design that went very far in that direction, where it's like the house itself contains all of the linking and the text somehow, so that you literally never go to a screen that is just about having text there as the main thing that's in it, right?
Yeah.
You know.
There's just some other things too, like the
Ratio.
ratio of, okay, so you go onto the cloud screen, right? And the title of that world is big letters at the top and always visible. Like you don't have to even go to a podium. So aside from the doors, the function of the cloud screen, just the fact that it's the cloud screen again, the first time, of course, you don't know what it is, but the second time and thereafter, it established a pattern.
嗯，
So you get that. You get the title, which is a hint about what's coming
Mm-hmm.
and sort of tells you what this world is called. And that's there before you even go to a podium, right? And so when you go to the podium and the story text comes up, it's like, okay, maybe you're interested and maybe you're not, but those other things already provided some value or interest as well, right? And so it's just this balancing act. I might make it a little bit differently today even, but it's okay. I feel good about that. It's the first puzzle game that I ever designed.
Yeah.
First single player game I ever designed. So,
嗯哼，把这个看掉。original 对，这个应该是没看过。把这个一本书的看掉，另外3本书都可以留着。然后这边还有几个，下一期这个肯定是能搞定。巨魁金，然后最后一个人还行。Thinking about the story screens and the inverse of a book's illustrations。嘛，不管这有多长，把它看完。
So
不是
I didn't want it to be like a story-based game in the way lots of games
Story-based.
are, where it's about the narrative or something. Those
Right.
people drove me nuts,
Right.
even back then.
Right.
But I like the idea. Okay, so it's some kind of hybrid. I want to have some writing and I want to have some gameplay. What does that look like? Well, there are illustrated storybooks,
Right.
some of which are for kids, but even
Right.
for like young adults and adults,
Mhm.
the further back in time you go, the more you see like things that are illustrated, right? And
Right.
then even old religious texts were often
Right.
just like
Yes.
illustrated, right?
Yes.
Here's Jesus dragging the cross or whatever.
Yeah.
Like that's a thing.
Yeah.
And so I was like, okay, what if it's like that, an illustrated storybook, but it's kind of flipped around, where the text takes the place of the illustration in that there's like less of it and it's there more for color and flavor. And then the gameplay is like the text in the storybook is the main part, right? Is most of what you're experiencing and playing most of the time. I don't know. Also ergonomically though, if there's going to be text as an introduction, like I liked it better as an introduction in the beginning of each world to
Yeah.
help set it up than like coming in the middle or
Right.
whatever.
Right.
Now, if I were text phobic,
text
like
phobic。
sometimes people do things that are inherently contradictory, right? They do that all the time.
Okay.
If I wanted text in the game but was scared of text in the game,
Yeah.
I would put it as little blurbs in the middle,
Right,
Or have
right.
little characters who would tell you backstory.
Right.
Like before I even started Braid, I think a very popular indie game was like
这个
Cave
说过了
Story,
，Cave Story。
Right.
and it was one of these like linear story-based adventures where you meet characters and they have dialogue that gives you information about the world. So that was very clearly a model that I could have done.
Yes.
But I wanted this to be an art game, right?
Right.
That was another one of the there were a lot of high-level parameters of what I was trying to do,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
I wanted it to be an art game, but unapologetically an art game.
哦，
right?
然后后面
Because
就是
I've been
另外一段
thinking about
嗯
art games and experimental games and all this stuff, and I was seeing that certain classes of things were not being
being
made.
made，这个下一期肯定能搞定了。另外那个好像也挺长的，而且还有一个这个香纱的设计 ，Chris Moore， 名色挺标准。再走一趟吧。这里不长，这个地方就已经挺多了，而且还分层，一跳一跳刚好能躲掉。这个还是往顶上走更容易吧？这边东西看起来不是很大，但数量确实多，要把这儿相杀，把这儿相杀才能看到那个，所以专门为了看这一个，你还得去右边绕一圈。那这个 screen 一旦过去，右边应该不多了。对了，下一期要从这儿先开始，这里是2个东西，把这个启动掉，甚至可以先把那个东西补掉。OK， 就这样，这第11期了，目标反正15期把这 design 搞定，这已经没有什么可以多想的了。